I think some of you are going to recognize our next storyteller. Does anybody live in Palo Alto? Have you ever called the police to get a skunk out from under your house or some kind of animal control? Well, our next storyteller, Bill Warrior, has been with the police department as the senior field officer for animal control for something like 34 years. So you may well have had him at your house before, but probably never as a storyteller. And he recently posted a story on our website that I'm going to tell you more about the website later. And it's a moving story about his grandmother-in-law. This goes back to the Chinese exclusion laws, because our country has a lot of history around immigration and fighting against immigration. So his story is going to take us back into a situation that we should all know more about. And just if you do go to the website, one of the things I loved about his story was the photograph of his wedding party at the bottom of his story, because everybody in the family is Chinese, and there he is in a kilt with everyone else. So Bill, come on up, and here's your... Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you, Media Center. It's first salon I've been to where I wasn't checking my dog in for a bath and trim. So this story has an ending and beginning at the Immigration Station National Landmark at China Cove on Angel Island on San Francisco Bay. And I'm going to backtrack in time a little bit, but Chinese Exclusion Act was a law passed by our Congress in 1882 and was rescinded by President Roosevelt in 1943. And during that period, it was ostensibly created to exclude unskilled labor from the country. There was a popular movement against unskilled labor following an economic depression in the 1870s, and the Chinese were a disenfranchised group in the country at the time. And they were looked at by organized labor, established labor in the country, as a threat to taking their jobs away. And so this act again was passed very clear. If you read it, it's saying unskilled labor not allowed. Other Chinese will be allowed in. Merchants, family members of merchants, tourists, ministers, students. Those were exemptions to the law. However, on the ground, the application of the law, and there's a wonderful study by a Stanford professor at the time, Mary Roberts Coolidge, in 1909. She published a paper on Chinese immigration and how it was being handled by the country. And she visited one of the immigration stations here in San Francisco at the time, which was actually a converted offices of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company at Pier 40 in San Francisco. She described it, or a contemporary newspaper account described it as the size of a 4-bedroom cottage, holding, at the time of the visit, 357 Chinese in cots stacked 6 high with indirect lighting, indirect ventilation, and people being held there for weeks at a time. And Professor Coolidge's paper mentioned this, and mentioned the staff that were working there seemed to be imbued with the tradition that this exclusion law was to be applied not just to unskilled labor, but to all Chinese. So it didn't matter your background. You would be going through a hazing process at the immigration station, I think would be the best way that I understand it from my grandmother-in-law, Wang Funyan, who may be known to some in the community. She lived here for 83 years as Fern Mock. She worked with her husband as a cook at the City Cafe in Palo Alto at that time for a number of years, and were able to buy a house in downtown Palo Alto in the 1940s where she lived out her life. But to go back even a little bit, back to Sun Yat-sen's village, Zhongshan in China, where Wang Funyan was born in 1908. She was living the privileged life of a merchant's daughter, and was given a secondary school education, which was unusual for young women at the time. So she could write. Her feet were not bound, unlike her paper mom. And they were very much settled where they were. They were in a very somewhat exclusive village. Um, Her father, who she never met, had been a merchant in Gilroy from 1882 onwards. And this was typical of the Guangdong men. They would come back to get married at some point. He was 22 years old at the time. Went back, he waited till 1906 to go back to get married, under probably considerable pressure from family at that point. He was marrying someone 26 years his junior. Stayed for the whole of, I believe, about 18 months, and left back for San Francisco with his wife expecting Wang Funyan. He arrived in the city on the day she was born and returned to Gilroy, where a year later he died of a heart attack on the streets there. And for reasons that still escape me, communication was cut off with the family in China. So when my wife's grandmother was finding herself in a corner in China due to the strike boycott of 1925-1926, which was a rather violent civil unrest between Canton labor and Hong Kong merchants. She found herself caught in the middle of that and having to attempt to run the picket lines where you were in danger of being on a tram that might get blown up or being shot if they saw you crossing. They were trying to shut Hong Kong down and were quite successful at it. But it was not an entirely popular uprising, and people were trying to get through on a regular basis. She managed to do that with her paper mom in 1926, and they headed for San Francisco with visa papers from the American embassy. Let me explain what a paper mom is here for a moment. Her bio mom, wanted some closure on what had happened to her husband. There was a presumption that he had passed away, and they wanted confirmation of that. There was also the strike boycott going on. It was becoming more difficult for merchant families to live where they were living in Canton. She had a merchant colleague. The family had a merchant colleague of Wang Shikong, the father, who had a son in America, and there was plans for an arranged marriage, which she was willing to do, to leave the country to get married to this person and establish a citizenship in the US. But as a merchant's daughter, she had had an exemption to the act. She was allowed to come in. When her father died, that exemption was lost. So this merchant colleague said, okay, I'll make you my daughter. This was a very common practice at the time for Chinese trying to get in. If they could buy papers from a family to say, this is my daughter, that was one way. In this particular way, there was a planned marriage, so there was no selling of papers. So Wang Funyan assumed the name of Chu Yuklin, the daughter of this merchant, and came over with those forged papers into the country. And the immigration station at China Cove at Angel Island was not an open arms place. It was called by the people that work there the guardian of the Western Gate. They saw as their mission to keep the Chinese out. The long-term goal of the Exclusion Act was to have all Chinese out of the country by the 1940s. That was what was predicted, that eventually the Chinese would just not be here. So Wang Funyan as Chu Yuklin arrives in San Francisco. She gets news from contacts while she's still aboard the ship that her father is dead. So she's processing a Chinese-only speaking woman whose life has always been in China, not in the West. She's pretending to be someone else, grieving for her father, all of 18 years old, coming in with her paper mom, and spending 5 weeks at the immigration station in San Francisco, mostly waiting. She told me that the food was terrible the first week she was there, which was common for people there that were working on an extreme budget. The steamship company was feeding you. There were a couple of food riots there over the decades there. But she mentioned the food was bad the first week, and then I was introduced to the cooks, and they were from my village, and after that my meals were wonderful. So the immigration station, if you ever get a chance to go there, and I'd love to give you a tour sometime if you like, there are at least 135 poems engraved in the walls of that wooden building. It was called the Wood House, the House of Jade, because it was painted green. One of those poems sticks out in my mind. I spent a night there to get an idea of what it was like for my grandmother-in-law staying there for 5 weeks. And I spent a winter's eve night there reading poems, not getting much sleep. And one of the poems that one of the men engraved in the walls, if I can remember right, goes, I, a 7-foot man, am ashamed I cannot extend myself. curled up in an enclosure. My movements are dictated by others. Enduring 100 humiliations, I can only cry in vain. This person's tears fall, but what can the blue heavens do? And that poem, I think, captures a lot of the feeling of being in the Wood House. A lot of culture shock going on, a lot of anxieties there, a lot of wondering why you're there, dealing with your stress of leaving your familiar place, going to an unfamiliar place. I admire greatly my grandmother-in-law for being able to go through that and to have a very long and happy life in the States here. She never felt it was a humiliation. She looked at it as just a necessary thing to get through, just like running through the difficulties she did to get out of China. And a poem that I composed from my night there, if I can remember this, goes like this. I walk through wooden corridors of jade and through the night, surrounded by ancestral lines of captive dreams of flight. In barracks, in room 105, where sun will fade at 3, to trace a line north by southwest from Gamsan to the sea. At solstice, at the winter's eve, where to my eyes it's plain, the lady they called Chuyoklun gave Wang Fenyan her name, gave her a chance for family in Gamsan to begin. First as captive, then set free, then landed she would win for all of us the richest life, a life without regret. When Canton girls are made of iron, the winter solstice is well met. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay.